It began not with thunder, but with silence. A silence so profound that even the warp seemed to hold its breath. Upon the ash-choked surface of Armageddon, where war had raged for centuries and the ground was layered with bones like sediment, a distortion appeared. Not a tear in reality, not a warp rift bleeding madness, but a fold, gentle as parchment creasing. The air shimmered with emerald light, and from that impossible crease stepped a figure no taller than a child. He was green, not the brutal, muscular green of the orcs who plagued this world, but a softer hue, like moss grown over ancient stone. His ears were vast and pointed, his eyes deep and golden, holding within them the weight of 900 years. He wore robes of simple cloth, tattered and worn, and leaned upon a gnarled walking stick. When his feet touched the scorched earth, the ground did not tremble, the warp did not scream, the chaos gods did not stir. There was only the faintest whisper, as if the universe itself had exhaled in relief. Yoda stood still, his large ears twitching as he absorbed the horror around him. The sky was a bruised tapestry of smoke and fire. In the distance, artillery thundered, each blast a hymn to mankind's desperation. Servitors shuffled past, their eyes dead, their limbs jerking with mechanical obedience. A child barely more than bones wrapped in skin, crouched in the rubble, clutching a tin cup, praying to a god who had not answered in 10,000 years. The Jedi Master closed his eyes. He reached out not with his hands, but with something deeper. The Force flowed through him as it always had, yet here it felt different, strained, polluted. The warp pressed against it like oil against water, two incompatible truths struggling to coexist. Yet the Force endured, it always did. For the Force was not power, not dominion, not hunger. It was balance, and this galaxy had forgotten what balance meant. Yoda opened his eyes and approached the child. She flinched, expecting violence. Violence was all she had ever known, but the small green figure only knelt beside her, his ancient face soft with sorrow. "Hungry you are," he said, his voice a rasp like wind through autumn leaves. The child stared, uncomprehending. Yoda reached into his robes and produced a small piece of dried fruit, a relic from a universe now impossibly distant. He placed it in her trembling hands. "Eat, strength you will need." The child bit into it and wept, not from pain, but from a taste she had never known: sweetness. In a galaxy where even food was a sacrament of suffering, this small act of kindness was heresy, and yet it was witnessed. A passing guardsman saw the green creature and the weeping child. He raised his lasgun, then hesitated. Something in the old one's eyes stayed his hand, not fear, not threat, but a presence that felt ancient, benevolent, wrong. Within hours, whispers spread through the refugee camps. A xenos had appeared, small, harmless, yet unsettling. The ecclesiarchy dispatched a preacher to investigate, a man whose faith was a bludgeon, whose sermons had condemned thousands. He found Yoda sitting among the wounded, his small hands hovering over a soldier whose leg had been torn away by shrapnel. The Jedi's eyes were closed, his breathing slow, and beneath his palms the wound began to close, not through medicine, not through bionics, but through will alone. The preacher's mouth opened, a denouncement forming on his lips, but when Yoda's gaze met his, the words died. For in those golden eyes the preacher saw not heresy, not Xeno's cunning, but something he had only read about in the oldest, most forbidden texts: compassion without condition, strength without cruelty, power that served rather than ruled. It was everything the Imperium had forgotten, everything the Emperor had once dreamed of, before ambition devoured mercy. The preacher fell to his knees, trembling. What are you?" Yoda's ears drooped slightly, a gesture of infinite weariness. "A stranger I am, lost far from home." He turned back to the wounded soldier, whose breathing had steadied, whose eyes no longer held the glazed stare of approaching death. "But help I can, help I must." The preacher did not report him. He could not. To do so would be to admit that something beyond the Emperor's light had brought hope to the hopeless. And hope, in the Imperium of man, was the most dangerous heresy of all. Far above in the orbital defense stations, auger arrays flickered with confusion. A presence had been detected, neither human nor orc, neither demon nor xenos of any known classification. It registered as absence, a void where something should be, yet wasn't. The Mechanicus tech priests chanted their unease, their hymns to the Omnissiah faltering. Even the machine's spirits seemed uncertain, their sacred logic unable to parse the anomaly. In the command bunker, Lord General Kurov reviewed the reports with narrowed eyes. Xeno's infiltration was not uncommon, but this was different. No violence, no sabotage, only healing, mercy. He crushed the data slate in his augmetic fist. "Heresy takes many forms," he growled. "Dispatch the Inquisition. If this creature spreads its poison, we burn the sector." But it was already too late. Yoda had begun to walk, through trenches filled with the dying, through habs where families huddled in terror, through the scorched wasteland where hope had been beaten into dust. and wherever he walked, something changed. Not in grand gestures, not in miracles that defied comprehension, but in small moments. A word of comfort to a guardsman who had lost his entire platoon. A touch that eased the tremors of a veteran haunted by horrors. A presence that whispered, without words, that suffering was not destiny. The Inquisition would come. The Adeptus Astartes would be summoned. The full weight of the Imperium's paranoia and fury would descend upon this small, unassuming figure. But for now, in the ruins of Armageddon, beneath a sky that had not seen stars in a century, Yoda walked. And the Force, that luminous thread that bound all living things, began to stir in a galaxy that had forgotten it ever existed. Somewhere deep in the warp, the Chaos Gods felt it, a presence that did not hunger, did not rage, did not despair. And for the first time in eons, they felt something they had long since abandoned: unease. The Inquisition arrived like a curse made manifest. Black ships descended through Armageddon's polluted skies, their hulls inscribed with prayers and purity seals, their engines screaming hymns of righteous fury. From their holds marched the soldiers of the Ordo Xenos, men and women who had stared into the abyss of alien horror and learned to stare back without flinching. At their head walked Inquisitor Matthias Vorn, a man whose face was a patchwork of scars and augmetics, whose faith was tempered in the fires of 100 purges. Vorn had read the reports, a Xenos creature, no larger than a child, wandering the war-torn surface, unarmed, unguarded, and yet everywhere it went, heresy followed. Not the heresy of blood and corruption, but something far more insidious, the heresy of hope. Soldiers who had been ready to die for the Emperor now spoke of peace. Citizens who had accepted suffering as the Emperor's will now dared to dream of a world without pain. This could not stand. The Inquisitor found Yoda in the ruins of a chapel, its roof collapsed, its altar shattered. The Jedi Master sat among the rubble, surrounded by children. He was teaching them not the Lectitio Divinitatis, not hymns of war, but something older. Anger, fear, aggression, he said, his voice soft as falling snow. The dark side they are, consume you they will if let them you do. But another way there is, peace, compassion, these stronger they are. The children listened, eyes wide. For the first time in their short, brutal lives, they heard words that were not commands, not threats, not prayers to a distant, uncaring God. One boy, no more than 6, asked, "But the Emperor protects us, doesn't he?" Yoda's ears drooped, his expression sorrowful. Protect you he may, but protect you from yourselves he cannot. That burden, yours alone it is. Vorn stepped forward, his bolt pistol drawn. Heresy, he said, his voice cold as the void. You poison their minds with Xenos lies. The children scattered, fleeing into the shadows. Only Yoda remained, his gaze meeting the Inquisitors without fear, without defiance, only sadness. Poison, you call it. Truth, I name it. Suffer these children do, because taught to suffer they are. Another way I show them. Vorn's finger tightened on the trigger. The Emperor's truth is the only truth. You are Xenos. You have no place in his realm. Yoda sighed, a sound like wind through gravestones. Emperor, Emperor, always the Emperor. But see him, have you? Speak to him, do you? Or only his servants who claim to know his will? The Jedi Master rose slowly, leaning on his stick. Once I too served an order. Great we thought ourselves. Wise, yet fall we did because listen we did not. Pride our downfall was. See it I do in your Imperium. The same path you walk. The Inquisitor's hand trembled, not from fear but from rage and something else. Doubt. The Xenos spoke with the authority of ages, and his words carried a weight that even the most fervent faith could not entirely dismiss. Vorn had seen too much, purged too many, to be entirely certain anymore, but certainty was all he had left. You will be taken for interrogation, Vorn said. If you resist, you will be destroyed. Yoda did not resist. He allowed himself to be shackled chains of blessed adamantium, inscribed with wards against sorcery. Yet even bound, he radiated calm. As the inquisitorial forces led him to their transport, the people watched in silence. No one dared speak, but in their eyes burned something dangerous. Not rebellion, not yet, but the seed of it, planted by a creature who had shown them that power need not be cruel. Aboard the black ship, Yoda was taken to an interrogation cell, a chamber designed to break minds, to scour souls of heresy. Servoskulls circled overhead, recording every word, every gesture. Vorn stood behind a one-way mirror, watching as his interrogators began their work. Yet no matter how they questioned, no matter how they threatened, the Xenos simply sat in meditation, his breathing slow, his expression serene. He mocks us, hissed one interrogator. No, said another, a psyker whose third eye wept blood. He pities us. Vorn slammed his fist against the glass. This was wrong. Everything about this creature was wrong. He was not violent, not deceptive, not any of the things xenos were supposed to be. He was something the Imperium had no protocol for, an enemy who offered no threat, a heretic who preached no lies, only uncomfortable truths. The psyker interrogator leaned forward, his voice a rasp. What are you xenos? What power do you serve? Yoda opened his eyes, and for a moment the psyker glimpsed something vast, an ocean of light, infinite and eternal, untouched by the warp's corruption. Serve I do not, serve the Force does not demand. Flow through all living things it does, connect us it does. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. He gestured to his small, aged body. Forgotten this, your galaxy has, forgotten what it means to live. The psyker recoiled, his mind reeling. He had touched the warp, felt its seething hatred, its endless hunger. But this was something else entirely, something pure. And purity in the 41st millennium was more alien than any xenos monstrosity. Vorn entered the chamber himself, dismissing the interrogators with a curt gesture. He stood before Yoda, his shadow looming over the small green figure. You say you offer truth. Then tell me this, xenos, why have you come to our galaxy? Yoda's ears lifted slightly, a gesture of weary amusement. Come, chose this I did not. Cast here I was, by forces beyond understanding. But since here I am, help I must, see suffering I do, see darkness I do, and turn away I cannot. Your help is not wanted, your presence is a blight. Wanted, perhaps not, needed. Yoda's gaze was piercing. Judge that, history will. Vorn felt something crack within him, a wall he had built over decades of service, of blood, of unwavering faith. He had seen worlds burn, had ordered the deaths of millions, all in the Emperor's name, all to preserve humanity. And yet this tiny creature who had done nothing but heal and comfort was named heretic. Was that justice, or was it simply fear? The Inquisitor turned away, his voice hollow. You will be executed at dawn. The Emperor's mercy is swift. As he left the chamber, he did not see the faint smile on Yoda's lips, not mocking, not triumphant, but sad. For the Jedi Master knew what Vorn did not. That execution would change nothing. The Force could not be killed, and the seeds he had planted were already growing. Dawn came to Armageddon as it always did, blood-red and reluctant, a sun struggling to pierce the eternal shroud of war. In the courtyard of the inquisitorial fortress, a pyre had been prepared, not of wood but of blessed promethium, sanctified by 100 priests, designed to burn hot enough to reduce even the most resilient xenos to ash. Around it stood ranks of Tempestus scions, their hellguns raised, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks. They were humanity's finest, and they would witness the cleansing of heresy. Yoda was led to the pyre in chains, his small feet dragging across the stone. He did not struggle, did not plead. His eyes took in the assembled crowd, soldiers, scribes, servitors, all gathered to watch him die, and among them, hiding in the shadows, the children he had taught. Their faces were streaked with tears, but they did not look away. They would bear witness as he had taught them. To see clearly, even in darkness, was the first step toward light. Inquisitor Vorn stood upon a raised platform, his voice amplified by vox gasters. Behold the fate of the heretic. Behold the fate of the xenos who dares corrupt the faithful. In the Emperor's name, we cleanse this abomination from his realm. The crowd responded with a roar, but it was hollow, performative. Many had heard whispers of what this creature had done, how he had healed the wounded, comforted the grieving, spoken words that eased the soul's agony. Was this truly heresy, or was it simply something the Imperium could not control? As the priests chanted and the promethium was lit, Yoda closed his eyes. He reached out with the Force, feeling the life around him, the fear, the doubt, the anger, but also the hope, fragile as a candle flame but burning nonetheless. He had walked many paths in his long life, had trained Jedi, fought wars, made mistakes that still haunted him, and now, at the end, he was to be burned for offering kindness. But the Force was with him. It always had been. The flames roared upward, a pillar of fire that should have consumed him instantly. Yet Yoda did not burn. The chains melted away, the heat parted around him like water around stone, and he stood unharmed in the heart of the inferno. The crowd gasped. The priests faltered in their chanting. Even Vorn, whose faith was iron, felt his certainty waver. Yoda stepped from the flames, his robes singed but his body untouched. He looked up at the Inquisitor, and his voice, though soft, carried across the courtyard as if the wind itself carried his words. Kill me you cannot. The Force, it binds all things. Destroy the body you may, but what I am, what I teach, this you cannot burn. A scion raised his hellgun, awaiting orders. Vorn's hand hovered over his bolt pistol. one word and the creature would be annihilated, but that word did not come. Because in that moment, Matthias Vorn understood something terrible. The xenos was right. You could not kill an idea. You could not burn hope. Before anyone could act, the sky split open. Not with warp fire, but with emerald lightning, a disturbance in reality itself, as if the universe had been torn by something beyond the materium and immaterium both. From that rift poured a presence, vast and ancient, and every soul present felt it. The psykers screamed, clutching their heads. The servitors collapsed, their machine spirits overwhelmed. Even the scions staggered, their training useless against a force they had no name for. And through the rift stepped figures, not demons, not xenos, but echoes, force ghosts shimmering and translucent, their forms radiating light untouched by the warp's taint. Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin Skywalker redeemed at last. They stood beside Yoda, not as warriors but as witnesses, and their presence was a declaration. The Force had come to the 41st millennium. Vorn fell to his knees, his augmetic eye flickering as it tried and failed to categorize what it was seeing. What is this sorcery? Yoda's voice was gentle but firm. Sorcery it is not, the Force it is, and deny it you cannot, suppress it you cannot, part of the universe it is, part of you. The Inquisitor looked up, his face twisted in anguish. Then we are damned. If this power exists beyond the Emperor's light, then everything we believe. Damned you are not, Yoda interrupted, but walking a path of suffering you are. Change you can, choose you must. For a long moment silence reigned. Then one by one the soldiers lowered their weapons. The priests ceased their chanting. The children emerged from the shadows, their faces filled with wonder. And Matthias Vorn, Inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, Hunter of Heretics, Slayer of the Unclean, wept. Because he realized that for all his faith, for all his service, he had been blind. The Emperor's light was not the only light. And perhaps, just perhaps, the galaxy's salvation lay not in purity through fire, but in balance, in compassion, in the courage to change. The Force ghosts faded, their message delivered. Yoda turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them all. A choice I give you. Walk the path of anger and fear, or walk the path of peace. Yours the choice is. But know this, judge you, the universe will, not by your power, but by your compassion. And with that, the small green Jedi Master walked away, leaning on his gnarled stick, leaving behind an Imperium that would never be the same. For he had planted a seed in the hardest soil imaginable, and against all odds, it had begun to grow. The news of what occurred on Armageddon spread like a plague through the Imperium's vast networks, Vox transmissions, astropathic whispers, even the forbidden data streams of the Mechanicus. A Xenos had walked through holy fire unharmed. A presence beyond the warp had manifested, and the Inquisition had not destroyed it. Worse still, witnesses spoke of an Inquisitor weeping before the creature, of soldiers laying down their arms, of hope kindled in the hearts of those who had known only despair. On Terra, within the shadowed halls of the Inquisitorial Palace, the High Lords convened in emergency session. The chamber was a cathedral of paranoia, its walls lined with the skulls of heretics, its air thick with incense meant to ward off corruption. Around the obsidian table sat representatives of the Imperium's most powerful factions, the Ecclesiarchy, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Officio Assassinorum, and the three great ordos of the Inquisition. Lord Inquisitor Torven, master of the Ordo Malleus, slammed his gauntleted fist upon the table. This cannot be tolerated. A Xenos preaches heresy, corrupts an Inquisitor, and we do nothing. Not nothing, replied Magos Dominus Zelketh, his voice a synthetic rasp. Data suggests the entity possesses capabilities beyond current Imperial understanding. Elimination attempts may prove costly. Cardinal Mesonius, resplendent in robes of gold and crimson, leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with fanatic fervor. Costly or not, the Emperor's will is clear. Suffer not the alien to live. This Yoda must burn, and all who have been touched by his corruption with him. A silence fell, heavy and oppressive. Then, from the far end of the table, a figure stirred, Inquisitor Lord Cyrus Vale, eldest of the assembled, his face hidden beneath a hood, his augmetic voice barely above a whisper. And if he cannot be burned, what then? The question hung in the air like a blade. None dared answer, for the implication was too dangerous, that something existed beyond the Emperor's dominion, beyond the Imperium's capacity to destroy. To admit such a thing was to admit that their absolute certainty was a lie. Far from Terra, on a forgotten agri-world named Veridia Prime, Yoda walked through fields of golden wheat. The world was peaceful, untouched by war, a rarity in the 41st millennium. Its people were simple farmers, taxed heavily by the Imperium but otherwise left alone. Here, the Jedi Master had come to rest, to meditate, to listen to the Force as it whispered through the grain. But peace in this galaxy was always temporary. The first sign of trouble was the silence. The birds ceased their singing, the wind stilled, and then from the sky drop pods screamed downward like meteors of righteous fury. They struck the earth with thunderous impacts, and from their smoldering doors emerged the angels of death, the Adeptus Astartes. Specifically the Black Templars, a chapter known for their zealotry, their hatred of xenos and psykers, their absolute devotion to the Emperor. Marshal Amalrich led the strike force, his black armor inscribed with oaths of hatred, his chainsword still slick with the blood of 1,000 battles. He had been given a simple order: find the xenos called Yoda and execute him. No trial, no mercy, only the Emperor's justice, swift and final. The Space Marines spread out across the fields, their helmets scanning for heat signatures, psychic disturbances, anything that might reveal their quarry. They found him sitting beneath an ancient tree, his eyes closed, his expression serene. He looked so small, so frail, that for a moment Amalrich wondered if the reports had been exaggerated. Then the xenos opened his eyes and the Marshal felt it, a presence vast as the void, ancient as the stars, and utterly untainted by the warp. "Come to kill me, you have," Yoda said, not a question but a statement. Amalrich raised his bolt pistol. "In the name of the Emperor, I deliver his judgment." Yoda sighed, his ears drooping. The Emperor, always the Emperor. Meet him, have you? Know his will, do you? Or only the will of those who speak for him? The Marshal's finger tightened on the trigger. "Do not test me, xenos. My faith is absolute." "Faith, yes, but wisdom." Yoda's gaze was piercing. "Wisdom to question, to doubt, these you lack. Dangerous, that is." "Silence," Amalrich fired, the bolt round screaming through the air, but it did not find its target. With a gesture almost too subtle to see, Yoda raised his hand, and the bolt round stopped mid-flight, suspended in the air. The Space Marines raised their weapons, a dozen bolters trained on the tiny figure, yet none fired. They were transfixed by the impossibility before them, a power that was not sorcery, not the warp, but something else entirely. Yoda released the bolt round, letting it fall harmlessly to the ground. "Fight you, I will not, but teach you I can. If listen, you will." Marshal Amalrich felt something he had not felt in decades: doubt. His conditioning, his faith, his genetic programming all screamed at him to destroy this creature. Yet his tactical mind, the part of him that had survived 100 battlefields, recognized a truth. This xenos was not an enemy. Or rather, he was an enemy to everything the Imperium had become: corruption, cruelty, blind obedience, but not to humanity itself. "Stand down," he ordered his men. The command was met with hesitation, but it was obeyed. The Black Templars lowered their weapons, though their hands remained on their triggers. Amalrich approached Yoda, his massive form towering over the Jedi Master. "You speak of teaching. What could you possibly teach one of the Emperor's angels?" Yoda smiled faintly. "Much, I think, taught warriors I have for 800 years. Strong they were, skilled. But strength without control, skill without compassion, these roads to darkness are." The Marshal knelt, bringing himself to the xenos' level. For the first time in his long service, he felt something other than rage, other than duty. He felt curiosity. "Then teach me, xenos, show me this wisdom you speak of." And there, beneath the ancient tree, as the golden wheat swayed in the wind, Yoda began to speak. He spoke of the force, of balance, of the dangers of absolutes. He spoke of the Jedi, who had fallen because they clung too tightly to dogma. He spoke of the Sith, who were consumed by their hunger for power. And he spoke of a truth that the Imperium had long forgotten. That true strength came not from domination, but from understanding, not from fear, but from compassion. The Black Templars listened, their genetically enhanced minds struggling to reconcile what they heard with everything they had been taught. Some rejected it outright, their faith too rigid to bend, but others, Marshal Amalrich among them, felt something shift within them, a crack in the armor of certainty, a question where there had only been absolutes. As the sun set over Viridia Prime, painting the fields in hues of amber and gold, Yoda finished his lesson. "Go now," he said softly. "Tell your Imperium what you have seen, what you have learned, and let them decide, continue on the path of suffering or walk a new way." Amalrich rose, his expression unreadable behind his helmet. He gave a single nod, then turned to his men. "We return to the chapter. This day's events will be recorded and reported. Let the High Lords judge what this means." As the Space Marines boarded their drop pods and ascended into the sky, Yoda watched them go. He knew what awaited him: more hunters, more zealots, more warriors convinced that their way was the only way. But he also knew that change, true change, began not with grand gestures but with small cracks in the facade of certainty. And he had just placed a crack in the Imperium's most unshakable warriors. Word of Marshal Amalrich's report reached Terra within days, carried by astropaths whose minds nearly shattered under the weight of what they transmitted. A squad of Black Templars, zealots among zealots, warriors who purged xenos with righteous fury, had stood down before a creature no taller than a child. They had listened to its teachings, and worst of all, some among them had been changed by what they heard. The ecclesiarchy erupted in outrage. Cardinal Mesonius declared Amalrich excommunicate, his name to be stricken from the chapter's records, his soul damned for eternity. But the Black Templars did not comply. Their High Marshal, Helbrecht himself, reviewed Amalrich's testimony and came to a conclusion that sent shockwaves through the Imperium. The xenos called Yoda was not an enemy to be destroyed, but a mystery to be understood. He wields no weapon, Helbrecht stated before the chapter's assembled chaplains. He corrupts no souls with demonic taint. He offers only wisdom, and wisdom is not heresy. The chaplains protested, but their arguments rang hollow. For Helbrecht had seen the Vox recordings, had heard the xenos speak, and recognized in those words an echo of something the Emperor himself might have once believed, before the Crusade, before the betrayal, before 10,000 years of suffering. Meanwhile, on the feral world of Tagros IV, Yoda had taken refuge among the primitives who dwelled there. These were humans untouched by the Imperium's influence, living in tribal communities, worshipping the sun and stars as their ancestors had. To them, the small green stranger was no threat but a curiosity, a wandering hermit who spoke in riddles and healed the sick with a touch. One evening, as Yoda sat beside a campfire, an old chieftain approached him. The man's face was weathered, his body bent with age, but his eyes were sharp. "Stranger," he said, "you are not of this world, yet you walk with the spirits. How is this?" Yoda poked at the fire with his stick, watching the embers rise into the night. "Walk with the spirits. No, walk with the Force I do. The same thing, perhaps, in different words." The chieftain nodded slowly. "We have a legend, passed down since the days of the sky gods. They say that once, long ago, a great being came to our world. He promised to unite the tribes, to lead us to the stars. But he was betrayed by his own sons, and war consumed him. Since then, we have been alone." Yoda's ears perked. This being, the Emperor, was he. "We call him the Golden One. Do you know of him?" The Jedi Master's expression grew somber. "Know of him I do. Met him I have not. But his shadow I feel across this galaxy. Great he was, powerful, but wise?" Yoda shook his head. "Wisdom, power does not guarantee." The chieftain leaned closer, his voice a whisper. "Then you say the Golden One was wrong?" "Wrong, no, but flawed, yes, as all beings are." Yoda looked up at the stars, their light undimmed by the Imperium's pollution. Tried to save humanity, he did, but in trying forgot what humanity was. Compassion, choice, hope, these he sacrificed for order, and now suffer the galaxy does. The old man was silent for a long time, then he placed a hand on Yoda's shoulder. "You carry a great burden, stranger, but know this, here in this place you are welcome. Rest, and perhaps the spirits will guide you." Yoda smiled faintly. Spirits, the Force, perhaps the same they are. But rest was not to be. That night the sky above Tagros IV split open, and from the wound in reality poured forth a horror beyond comprehension. A chaos warband, led by a sorcerer of Tzinch, had tracked the disturbance in the warp, a presence that did not belong, a soul untainted by corruption. To the ruinous powers, such purity was an affront, a challenge that could not go unanswered. The raiders descended upon the village like locusts, their armor twisted and baroque, their weapons dripping with unnatural fire. The tribesmen fought with spears and courage, but they were no match for transhuman monsters. Within minutes, the village was ablaze, the screams of the dying echoing through the jungle. Yoda stood at the center of the carnage, his lightsaber, dormant for so long, igniting with a snap hiss. Its emerald blade cast an eerie glow, and for a moment even the Chaos Marines hesitated. They had seen many weapons, many horrors, but this was different. This was a light that did not flicker, did not waver, a purity that the warp could not touch. The sorcerer laughed, his voice a cacophony of overlapping madness. "So, the little xenos has teeth. Tzinch has foreseen this moment. You are an anomaly, a glitch in the great game, and we shall correct you." Yoda's stance was low, his movements fluid despite his age. "Correct me. No, free you perhaps from the chains you do not see." The sorcerer unleashed a torrent of warp fire, reality itself bending to his will. But Yoda moved not away but through it. The Force guided his steps, and where the flames sought to burn, they found only empty air. His lightsaber danced, deflecting bolts of eldritch energy, severing the barrels of corrupted weapons. He did not strike to kill, but to disarm, to incapacitate, to give even these damned souls a chance to retreat. But chaos does not retreat. The sorcerer's warband pressed the attack, their mutations and blessings making them relentless, and for a moment it seemed Yoda would be overwhelmed. Then the Force surged, not as violence but as presence. The ground trembled, the air thickened, and every Chaos Marine felt it, a weight pressing upon their souls, a light burning away the lies they had believed, the promises they had been fed. One by one, they fell to their knees, not from wounds, but from revelation. For the first time since their damnation, they saw clearly. They saw what they had become, what they had traded their souls for, and the agony of that knowledge was greater than any blade. The sorcerer screamed, clutching his head as his connection to the warp flickered. What have you done? Yoda deactivated his lightsaber, his voice heavy with sorrow. Done, shown you the truth I have. What you do with it, your choice it is. The sorcerer fled, dragging his broken warband with him. The village was saved, but the cost was written on Yoda's face. He had not wanted to fight, he never did, but the galaxy, it seemed, would not let him rest. As the survivors emerged from hiding, the old chieftain approached, his eyes wide with awe. You are one of the sky gods. Yoda shook his head wearily. A god? No, just an old fool trying to make amends. He looked up at the stars, now visible through the dissipating smoke, but perhaps a fool with a purpose. And in the warp, the Chaos gods took notice. This Yoda was no mere anomaly. He was a threat to their power, to their influence, to the very foundation of their existence. And so, they began to plot his end, unaware that in doing so, they had already lost. In the Eye of Terror, where reality bled into madness and time itself twisted like smoke, the four Chaos gods convened. Not in unity, they were incapable of such, but in shared purpose. Khorne brooded upon his throne of skulls, Nurgle chuckled in his garden of rot, Slaanesh writhed in decadent ecstasy, and Tzeentch watched all with 1,000 eyes. Before them, in the infinite vastness of the warp, hung the image of a small green creature, meditating beneath a tree. This thing, Khorne growled, his voice a rumble of eternal rage. It does not bleed, does not kill, does not rage. It is an insult to everything I am. Nurgle stirred, maggots spilling from his bloated form. I find it delightful in a way. It resists decay, resists despair. Such resilience is admirable, but it must still be broken. Slaanesh laughed, a sound like shattering glass. Oh, I have tried to tempt it, to twist its desires into obsession, but it wants nothing. Nothing, can you imagine? A soul without yearning is a soul I cannot touch. Tzeentch's many voices spoke as one, overlapping in dissonant harmony. It is a variable I did not foresee, a piece on the board that moves by rules I do not know. It must be removed, or the great game itself is threatened. And so the ruinous powers made a pact, temporary, fragile, but unified in intent. They would send their greatest champions, their most terrible demons, to hunt the Jedi Master. And when they found him, they would tear his soul apart, scattering it across the warp until nothing remained but screaming echoes. On the shrine world of Ophelia VII, Yoda had taken shelter in a monastery, a place of prayer and contemplation. The Sisters of Battle who dwelt there had been wary at first. Xenos were to be purged on sight without question. But Sister Superior Celestine, a woman of both faith and wisdom, had seen something in the small creature's eyes. Not malice, not heresy, but suffering, carried like a burden too heavy for one so small. "Why do you wander, Xenos?" she asked one evening, as they sat in the chapel, surrounded by icons of the Emperor. Yoda gazed up at the golden statues, the stained glass depicting the Emperor's triumphs. "Wander because nowhere to go I have. Cast into this galaxy I was by fate or chance, but while here help I must. Too much suffering there is, too much pain." Celestine's hand rested on her bolter, though she made no move to draw it. Suffering is the Emperor's test. Through it, we are purified. Purified? Yoda's voice was gentle but firm. Or broken? Look at your sisters. See their scars, their hollow eyes. Devoted they are, yes, but happy? At peace? No. Taught to suffer they are, and suffer they do. But necessary is it, or simply tradition? The Sister Superior's jaw tightened. You speak dangerously, Xenos. The Emperor's word is law. Law, yes, but whose law? The Emperor's or those who claim to speak for him? Yoda turned to face her fully. Ask yourself, sister, serve the Emperor, do you, or serve those who use his name to control you? Before Celestine could respond, the monastery's alarms blared. The warp shuddered, and from the sky descended horror-given form, a greater demon of corn, its body a mountain of muscle and brass, its axe dripping with the blood of 1,000 worlds. Behind it came legions of lesser demons, howling with mindless fury. The Chaos Gods had made their move. The Sisters of Battle rallied, their bolters roaring, their flamers scorching demon flesh. But they were few, and the demons were endless. Celestine fought at the forefront, her faith a shield, her blade a prayer made manifest. Yet even she knew this was a battle they could not win. Yoda emerged from the chapel, his lightsaber igniting once more. The greater demon turned its burning eyes upon him and laughed, a sound like grinding metal. So, the little anomaly reveals itself. Korn sends his regards, xenos. Your death will be glorious. Yoda said nothing. He simply raised his hand and the force flowed through him, not as a weapon, but as a tide, vast and unyielding. The demons staggered, their forms flickering as if reality itself rejected them. The greater demon roared, swinging its axe, but Yoda was no longer there. He moved like water, like wind, his lightsaber carving through the warp spawn with precision born of centuries. But this was no ordinary battle. The demons were manifestations of the warp itself, and they did not die easily. For every one Yoda struck down, 2 more clawed their way into reality. His breathing grew labored, his movements slower. He was ancient, far older than any being had a right to be, and even the Force could not hold back time forever. Celestine saw him falter and made a choice. She charged into the fray, her blade burning with holy fire, her voice raised in a hymn of defiance. For the Emperor, she cried, and the sisters rallied behind her. Together, they formed a wall of faith and fury, standing beside the xenos they had been taught to hate. Yoda glanced at her, and for a moment their eyes met. He nodded, a gesture of gratitude, of respect, and together they fought. Jedi and sister, xenos and human, united not by dogma, but by a shared refusal to yield. The battle raged for hours, until the monastery was a ruin and the ground was slick with ichor and blood. And then, at the moment of greatest despair, something changed. The demons hesitated, their forms wavering. The greater demon snarled, looking skyward, and for the first time it felt something it had never known, fear. For above them the warp itself was bending, not collapsing, but shifting, as if something vast and ancient was pushing back. The Force was fighting the warp, 2 cosmic powers locked in a struggle beyond mortal comprehension. And in that struggle, the demons found themselves weakened, diminished, unable to maintain their presence. With a final, defiant roar, the greater demon dissolved, dragged back into the warp. The lesser demons followed, their howls fading into silence. The monastery was saved, though barely. Celestine collapsed to her knees, her armor cracked, her strength spent. Yoda approached, placing a small hand on her shoulder. Fought well, you did, brave you are. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with something she could not name. Why did you fight for us? We are not your people. This is not your war. Yoda's expression was infinitely sad. My war, no, but my responsibility it is. See suffering and turn away, this a Jedi cannot do. This I will not do. Sister Superior Celestine bowed her head, and in that moment her faith shifted. Not broken, but expanded. She still believed in the Emperor, but now she also believed in something else, that perhaps the galaxy's salvation would not come from one source, but from many. From faith and wisdom, from strength and compassion, from humanity and those willing to stand beside it. And in the warp, the Chaos Gods screamed in frustration, for they had failed, not because Yoda was stronger, but because he had reminded the Imperium of something it had forgotten, that unity did not require uniformity, and that hope could bloom even in the darkest soil. The tale of the battle at Ophelia VII spread across the Imperium like wildfire, carried by astropaths, vox transmissions, and the whispered rumors of pilgrims. A xenos had fought alongside the Sisters of Battle. A creature of unknown origin had stood against the demons of Korn and prevailed. And most troubling of all, witnesses claimed that Sister Superior Celestine herself had fought beside the creature, had called it ally. The ecclesiarchy's response was swift and brutal. Celestine was summoned to Terra to stand trial for heresy. Her sisters were interrogated, their armor stripped, their faith tested in the most savage ways the Inquisition could devise, yet none recanted. They spoke of what they had seen, of a being who fought not with hatred but with purpose, who healed rather than destroyed, who offered wisdom rather than commands. On Terra in the Hall of Judgment, a vast cathedral where the accused stood before the combined might of the ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition. Sister Superior Celestine knelt in chains. Above her, Cardinal Mesonius presided, his face twisted in righteous fury. Around her, thousands of the faithful watched, their eyes hungry for condemnation. You stand accused of consorting with xenos, of abandoning the Emperor's light, of spreading the poison of heresy, Mesonius intoned, his voice echoing through the hall. How do you answer? Celestine raised her head, her voice steady despite the chains. I answer that I did what the Emperor would have done. I protected the innocent, I fought evil, and I accepted help from an ally who sought nothing in return. The crowd roared in outrage. Mesonius slammed his staff against the marble floor, demanding silence. An ally, a xenos is no ally. It is a corruption, a blight. A teacher, Celestine interrupted, her voice cutting through the noise. He taught me that faith is not obedience, that devotion is not blindness, that the Emperor's light is not a cage but a guide. Mesonius's face purpled with rage. Heresy, you speak heresy in the Emperor's own house. Then the Emperor's house has forgotten his teachings, Celestine shot back. He walked among mortals once, did he not? He learned from them, fought beside them, bled with them. When did we decide that to follow him means to shut out all others? When did faith become fear? The hall erupted into chaos. Some shouted for her death, others for her vindication. And amid the cacophony, a voice soft, raspy, impossible to ignore, spoke from the shadows. Wise words the sister speaks. The crowd fell silent, every head turned, and there, standing at the entrance to the Hall of Judgment, leaning on his gnarled stick, was Yoda. Mesonius's eyes widened in shock and fury. Seize him, kill the xenos. Armored guards rushed forward, their halberds raised, their faith absolute. But as they neared Yoda, they stopped. Not from fear, but from an overwhelming sense of presence, something vast and ancient that pressed upon their souls without malice, without threat, only with the weight of truth. Yoda walked forward, his steps slow but deliberate. The crowd parted before him, some in awe, others in terror. He reached the center of the hall and looked up at Cardinal Mesonius, his golden eyes reflecting centuries of experience. Come here, I have to speak, Yoda said. Listen, will you, or only condemn? Mesonius raised his staff, his voice shaking with fury. We do not negotiate with xenos, we do not. Negotiate, Yoda interrupted gently. No, speak, I will. Listen, you will. Or prove, you will, that faith has become tyranny. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, from the back of the hall, a figure stepped forward. Inquisitor Lord Cyrus Vale, the eldest of the Inquisition, his face hidden beneath his hood. Let the xenos speak, he said, his augmetic voice carrying authority that even Mesonius could not ignore. If his words are heresy, we will know, and if they are truth, then we have a greater problem. Mesonius seethed, but he nodded curtly. Yoda bowed his head in gratitude and began to speak. Come to your galaxy I did not by choice. Lost I was, alone, but see suffering I did, see darkness I did, and turn away I could not. He gestured to Celestine, still kneeling in chains. This woman devoted she is, faithful, brave, yet chains you place upon her for helping another, for choosing compassion over cruelty. Is this the Emperor's will, or yours? The crowd murmured, uncertain. Yoda continued, his voice soft but unyielding. 800 years I lived, trained warriors I did, fought wars I did, and learned I did that power without wisdom is destruction. Faith without question is blindness. The Jedi great we thought ourselves. Fell we did because listen, we did not. See it I do in your Imperium, the same path you walk. Mesonius slammed his staff again. You dare compare the Emperor's Imperium to your failed order. Yoda's gaze was piercing. Failed, yes, admit it I do, but learn from failure I have. Learn, will you, or repeat, will you, the same mistakes? Inquisitor Vale stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. What would you have us do, xenos? Abandon the Emperor. Embrace xenos and heretics as equals. The Imperium stands because we are vigilant, because we do not falter. Vigilant, yes, Yoda replied. But vigilance, when it becomes paranoia, when it becomes cruelty, this not strength is. This weakness is, fear it is, and fear the path to darkness. He turned to the assembled crowd, his voice rising, carrying to every corner of the vast hall. The Emperor great he was, powerful, but alone he stood, trust no one he did, and betrayed he was by those closest to him. Why? Because love he did not show, compassion he did not give, only duty, only command, and so his sons fell because taught to be strong they were, but not taught to be human. The hall was deathly silent. Even Mesonius seemed at a loss for words, for Yoda had spoken a truth that none dared voice, that the Emperor's greatest failure was not his power, but his isolation, that he had tried to save humanity by becoming something other than human. Yoda turned to Celestine, raising his small hand, the chains binding her shattered, falling away like dust. Free, you are, free, you always were, remember that. He turned to leave, his task done, but Inquisitor Vale called out, "Wait, if you are right, if the Imperium walks a path to ruin, then what would you have us do?" Yoda paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Change you must, not your faith, not your devotion, but your hearts, open them. Let in light not just the Emperor, but all light. Balance you must find, or consumed you will be by the darkness you fight." And with that, the small green Jedi Master walked out of the Hall of Judgment, leaving behind an Imperium that would never be the same. Some called him a prophet, others a heretic, but none could deny that his words had planted seeds of doubt, and in an empire built on absolute certainty, doubt was the most dangerous weapon of all. The Imperium fractured, not in open rebellion, but in quiet schism. Across a million worlds, individuals began to question, not loudly, not defiantly, but in the silence of their own hearts. Guardsmen wondered if their sacrifices truly honored the Emperor, or merely fed the machinery of an empire that valued compliance over compassion. Priests found themselves hesitating before condemning the faithful, asking if judgment had become cruelty. Even among the Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's angels, whispers spread, quiet debates in the Reclusium, questions that had no easy answers. And at the center of this growing storm stood Yoda, a figure no larger than a child, who walked through the galaxy with only a stick and the Force as his companions. He had traveled to the hive world of Necromunda, where billions lived in squalor, their lives measured in sweat and suffering. Here, the Imperium's promise of salvation was a bitter joke, and hope was a currency no one could afford. Yoda descended into the Underhive, where even the Arbites dared not tread, where gangs ruled through violence and the only law was survival. In the deepest, darkest levels, he found a child, a girl no more than 10, her body twisted by mutation, her eyes glowing faintly with psychic potential. She huddled in a corner, surrounded by corpses, the victims of her uncontrolled powers. When she saw Yoda, she recoiled, expecting another hunter, another executioner. Instead, he sat beside her, his expression kind. "Afraid you are," he said softly. "Afraid of yourself, afraid of your power." The girl nodded, tears streaming down her malformed face. "They say I'm cursed, that I'm evil, that I should die." Yoda placed a small hand on hers. "Evil you are not, untrained you are, alone, but change this can, teach you I will." Over the following days, Yoda worked with the girl, showing her how to calm her mind, how to reach out with the Force rather than lash out with the warp. It was delicate work. The warp was a corruption, a twisting of the galaxy's natural order, while the Force was something purer, a flow that could heal as easily as it could harm. The girl was a psyker, yes, but she was also human, capable of choice, capable of growth. Slowly, the glow in her eyes faded, the tremors that had racked her body ceased, and for the first time in her short, terrible life, she smiled. But their peace was short-lived. The black ships had come to Necromunda, the dreaded vessels of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, hunting for psykers to feed the Emperor's endless hunger. They descended into the Underhive, their sensors tracking the psychic residue, their enforcers armed with null rods and sanctified chains. When they found Yoda and the girl, the enforcers hesitated. The girl registered as a psyker, but the readings were wrong. Calm, controlled, no warp taint, no corruption. And beside her stood the xenos, the creature whose name had become a whisper across the Imperium. The lead enforcer, a woman whose face was hidden behind a rebreather, raised her null rod. "Step away from the psyker, xenos. She belongs to the Imperium." Yoda stood, placing himself between the enforcer and the girl. "Belongs, a person she is, not property." "She is a witch," the enforcer said coldly. "Untrained psykers are a threat to all humanity. She will be taken to Terra, tested, and if found worthy, bound to the Emperor's service. If not, she will be culled." Yoda's ears drooped, his voice heavy with sorrow. "And this you call mercy?" The enforcer did not respond. She raised her null rod, its field designed to disrupt psychic energy, to sever the connection between a psyker and the warp. But when the field touched Yoda, it did nothing. He was not connected to the warp. He was something else entirely. With a flick of his hand, the null rod flew from the enforcer's grasp. The other enforcers raised their weapons, but Yoda gestured again, and their guns jammed, their armor locked in place. He did not harm them, merely rendered them unable to act. "Go," he said to the girl. "Run, hide, and remember, evils you are not. Capable of great goods you are if choose it you do." The girl hesitated, then nodded. She vanished into the shadows of the underhive, her future uncertain, but at least her own. The lead enforcer glared at Yoda, her voice shaking with rage. "You have condemned her. Without training, without binding, she will fall to chaos. Her blood will be on your hands." Yoda met her gaze, his golden eyes sad but unyielding. "Perhaps, but hers the choice will be, not yours, not mine, and choice the most sacred thing it is." As he walked away, the enforcers shouted after him, their threats echoing through the hive. But Yoda did not look back. He had made his choice, and he would bear the consequences, as he always had. Far above, on the surface of Necromunda, a transport awaited him, an unlikely ally, Marshal Amalrich of the Black Templars, who had been searching for the Jedi Master. The Space Marine knelt as Yoda approached, his massive form dwarfing the small figure. "I have been ordered to bring you to Terra," Amalrich said, "to stand before the Emperor himself." Yoda tilted his head, curious. "And obey, will you?" Amalrich was silent for a long moment. Then he rose, his voice steady. "Yes, but not as a prisoner, as a guest. There are those on Terra who wish to hear your wisdom, and there are those who wish to silence you. Which prevails, that remains to be seen." Yoda nodded. "To Terra, then. Meet the Emperor I will. See, I will, if worth saving, this Imperium is." As the transport ascended into the ash-choked sky, Yoda gazed out at the hive, at the billions who suffered within it, and wondered, could one small voice truly change a galaxy? Or would he, like so many before him, be crushed beneath the weight of an empire too vast, too entrenched to ever truly change? Only time would tell, and time, in the 41st millennium, was a luxury few could afford. The journey to Terra was long, taking them through the warp's treacherous currents, past worlds burning with war and systems swallowed by darkness. Marshal Amalrich's strike cruiser, the unrelenting faith, cut through the void with the grim determination of a crusader on pilgrimage. Yoda remained in his quarters, a sparse chamber that the Black Templars had prepared for him, humble, befitting a guest, yet watched constantly by servoskulls and Chaplain Grimvold, whose duty was to ensure the xenos did not corrupt the crew. But corruption was not Yoda's way. He spent his days in meditation, reaching out with the Force, feeling the ebb and flow of life throughout the ship. He sensed the crew hardened warriors, their souls encased in duty and faith, yet beneath that armor fear. Fear of failure, fear of damnation, fear of a universe that devoured hope as easily as it devoured worlds. He did not intrude upon their thoughts, did not impose his will. He simply listened. One night, Chaplain Grimvold entered his chamber, his skull-faced helm tucked under one arm, his scarred face illuminated by the dim candlelight. "You meditate often, xenos. What is it you seek?" Yoda opened his eyes, his expression serene. "Seek nothing. Listen, I do, to the Force, to the galaxy, to the whispers of those who suffer." Grimvold frowned, his hand resting on his Crozius. "The only voice worth hearing is the Emperor's. All else is temptation, the lure of heresy." "Perhaps," Yoda replied gently. "But tell me, Chaplain, hear the Emperor, do you, or only those who claim to speak for him?" Grimvold's jaw tightened. "I hear his will through scripture, through the teachings of the Codex, through the wisdom of my chapter. That is enough." "Enough for you, perhaps, but enough for them." Yoda gestured toward the bulkhead, beyond which lay the crew, the servitors, the countless souls who lived and died in the Emperor's name. Suffer they do, bleed they do, and told they are that this the Emperor's will is. But is it, or simply the will of those who profit from their suffering? The chaplain's hand tightened around his Crozius, his voice a low growl. "You speak dangerously, xenos." "Dangerously, perhaps, but necessarily, yes." Yoda's gaze was steady, unwavering. "The Jedi, once we were taught not to question. Serve the Republic we must without doubt, without hesitation. And so serve we did, even as it fell into darkness, even as our leaders betrayed us. Learned I have that obedience without question not loyalty is, slavery it is." Grimvold stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and left. But as he walked the corridors of the unrelenting faith, his mind churned with questions he could not silence, doubts he could not pray away. and he wondered, was the xenos a heretic, or a mirror, reflecting truths the Imperium had long refused to see? When the ship finally emerged from the warp above Terra, Yoda stood at the viewport, gazing down at the throne world. It was a monument to humanity's endurance and its hubris, a planet encased in city, its surface scarred by millennia of industry, its sky choked with the smoke of endless production. And at its heart, the Imperial Palace, a mountain of gold and stone, where the Emperor sat entombed upon the golden throne. As the shuttle descended, Yoda felt it, a presence vast beyond comprehension, a mind stretched across the galaxy, holding back the tides of chaos through sheer, agonizing will. The Emperor, even diminished, even dying, his power was undeniable, but so too was his pain. For 10,000 years he had suffered, a god bound to a throne, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to die. It was a fate Yoda could scarcely imagine, and it filled him with profound sorrow. The shuttle landed in the sanctum, where custods awaited, their golden armor gleaming, their guardian spears held at attention. At their head stood Captain General Trajan Valorous, the greatest of the 10,000, whose authority was second only to the Emperor himself. He regarded Yoda with eyes that had seen the birth and death of empires, and his voice was measured, neither hostile nor welcoming. Yoda of the Jedi Order, you stand upon the most sacred ground in the Imperium. The Emperor has acknowledged your presence. You will be brought before the throne. Yoda bowed his head respectfully. Honored, I am, speak with him I hope to, understand I must, what drives this galaxy to such suffering. Valorous said nothing, merely gestured for Yoda to follow. The procession moved through corridors of gold and marble, past statues of heroes long dead, past murals depicting the Emperor's triumphs. Everywhere, Yoda felt it, faith, devotion, but also desperation. The Imperium clung to the Emperor's memory like a drowning man clings to driftwood, terrified that if they let go, they would be swallowed by the darkness. At last they reached the inner sanctum, the heart of the palace, the throne room itself. It was vast beyond measure, a cathedral of technology and suffering, and at its center, upon a throne of gold and agony, sat the Emperor of mankind. His body was skeletal, preserved through arcane machinery, his face hidden behind a mask of gold. Cables and tubes fed into him, drawing upon his psychic might to fuel the astronomicon, the beacon that guided humanity through the warp. He had not moved in 10 millennia, had not spoken, and yet when Yoda entered, something changed. The air grew warm, the oppressive weight of despair lightened, and a presence ancient, immense, and infinitely weary reached out, not with words but with thought, with emotion, with the echoes of a mind that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. Who are you who walks my halls uninvited, yet without malice? Yoda knelt not in submission but in respect. Yoda, I am, a stranger in your galaxy, a wanderer seeking to understand, and perhaps to help. Help. The Emperor's presence swirled around him, curious, cautious. You are not of this reality, not of the materium nor the immaterium. What are you? A servant of the Force I am, a teacher, a guardian. Once powerful I was, but age and failure humbled me. Now only wisdom I offer, and a question worth saving is this galaxy, or too far gone is it? The Emperor was silent for a long moment, and Yoda felt the weight of his consideration, the slow, grinding gears of a mind that had not known rest in 10,000 years. Then, finally, a response. It is broken, corrupted, lost. I built it to be eternal, and it has become a prison. My sons betrayed me, my dream died, and yet I endure, because if I do not, all will fall. Is that worth saving? I do not know. Yoda's heart ached at the loneliness, the sorrow, the crushing burden that the Emperor bore alone. He rose, his small form dwarfed by the throne, and yet in that moment he seemed taller than any Primarch, any custodian. Endure you do, yes, but live do you, or simply exist, trapped by duty, by the fear that without you all will crumble. What else is there? Hope, Yoda said softly. Change, the courage to let go, to trust, to allow others to carry the burden. Alone you are, but alone you need not be. The throne room shuddered, the air crackling with psychic energy. The custods tensed, their spears raised, fearing an attack. But it was not violence, it was emotion. The Emperor, for the first time in 10,000 years, felt something other than duty, other than pain. He felt possibility. And if I let go and they fail, if I trust and they fall to darkness? Yoda met his gaze, his golden eyes steady. Then fall they will, but their failure, theirs it will be, not yours. Carry the galaxy upon your shoulders you cannot forever. At some point let go you must, or crushed you will be by the weight. Silence, the vast, echoing silence of a god reconsidering the purpose of his existence. And then, a whisper, so faint that even the custodes did not hear it, but Yoda did. "Perhaps you are right." The audience ended, and Yoda was escorted from the throne room, but the galaxy had already shifted. The Emperor's whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, had nonetheless rippled through the warp, a tremor felt by every psyker, every astropath, every soul touched by his light. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor had entertained the possibility of change, and that possibility, no matter how small, was a spark in the darkness. As Yoda departed the palace, he was not alone. Sister Superior Celestine, absolved of heresy and reinstated by order of the Emperor himself, walked beside him. Marshal Amalrich and a contingent of Black Templars followed, their oaths reforged not in blind obedience but in conscious devotion. And behind them came others, inquisitors who had seen too much to remain certain, tech priests whose logic compelled them to question, guardsmen whose faith had been tested and found wanting. They were few, scattered, a drop in the ocean of the Imperium's vastness, but they were a beginning. Yoda returned to the stars, not as a conqueror, not as a prophet, but as a teacher. He traveled from world to world, offering wisdom to those who would listen, healing those who could be healed, defending those who could not defend themselves. And wherever he went, he left behind a question: is this the only way? On Cadia, where the Eye of Terror loomed, he taught guardsmen to resist chaos not through hatred, but through inner peace. On Mars, he spoke with the Mechanicus, showing them that knowledge and wisdom were not the same, that understanding the universe required more than data, it required compassion. And on a forgotten agri-world, he met a young boy who asked, "Are you a god?" Yoda smiled, his ears drooping with amusement. "A god? No, just an old teacher doing his best." "Then why do they fear you?" "Fear me? No, fear change they do. Fear the unknown. Fear that wrong they have been all along. And that fear, the most dangerous thing it is." The boy thought about this, then nodded. "Will you teach me?" Yoda's smile widened. "Already teaching I am. Listen, you are, and that the first step is." Years passed, or perhaps only moments, for time in the 41st millennium was a fluid, broken thing. The Imperium did not fall, as so many had feared, but neither did it remain unchanged. Slowly, imperceptibly, the rigid doctrines began to bend. The Inquisition, once absolute in its judgments, began to weigh mercy alongside justice. The ecclesiarchy, once unyielding in its condemnation, began to speak of compassion as a virtue, not a weakness. And in the warp, the Chaos Gods raged, for their hold on the galaxy was weakening, not through grand battles, not through crusades, but through the quiet spread of wisdom, the gradual awakening of souls who had been asleep for millennia. The galaxy was learning, slowly and painfully, that there was another way. But Yoda knew his time was limited. The Force had brought him here for a reason, and that reason was nearly fulfilled. One evening, as he sat beneath a tree on a peaceful world whose name he had never learned, he felt it, a shift, a pull, the Force calling him home. He closed his eyes, his breathing slow and steady. "Finished, my work here is. Rest I can at last." And as his body faded, becoming one with the Force, a presence emerged beside him, a shimmering, translucent form. The Emperor, no longer bound to the throne, no longer trapped by duty, free at last to speak. "You were right, Jedi," the Emperor said, his voice no longer burdened by pain. "I held on too long, feared too much, but now I can let go, let them find their own way, and perhaps in doing so they will succeed where I failed." Yoda smiled, his form glowing softly. "Succeed or fail, there's the choice is, and that the greatest gift it is." Together they faded into the light, two ancient souls passing into legend. And across the galaxy, those who had known them, who had been touched by their presence, looked up at the stars and felt, for the first time in their lives, something they had thought impossible. The hope. The Imperium did not collapse overnight. Grand institutions, built over 10,000 years, do not crumble in a day, but something fundamental had shifted. The Emperor's withdrawal from active psychic dominance, his choice to let humanity guide itself, created a vacuum that could not be filled by dogma alone. For the first time since the Horus Heresy, the Imperium was forced to rely not on divine mandate, but on the choices of individuals. Some worlds flourished. Governors who had ruled through fear discovered that compassion yielded stability. Guardsmen, no longer driven solely by terror of commissars, fought with renewed purpose. Even among the Adeptus Astartes, the most rigid of the Emperor's creations, discussions arose in chapter monasteries. debates about duty, honor, and what it truly meant to serve humanity. But not all welcomed change. The old guard of the ecclesiarchy clung to their power, denouncing the reforms as the work of heretics and xenos corruption. Inquisitors of the Ordo Hereticus launched purges against those who spoke Yoda's teachings, burning worlds they deemed compromised. The galaxy bled, as it always had, but now the blood was spilled not just against external enemies, but in civil strife. On Terra, in the absence of the Emperor's direct will, the High Lords convened in crisis. Some called for a return to the old ways, for the re-establishment of absolute control. Others, emboldened by the seeds Yoda had planted, argued for reform, for a new vision of the Imperium built not on fear but on purpose. The debate raged for years, decades, centuries, and in that time the galaxy continued to turn. The Tyranids still devoured worlds, the Orcs still waged their endless wagh, chaos still corrupted, but humanity, battered, broken, yet enduring, began to fight not as slaves to a distant god, but as beings with agency, with choice, with hope. On a remote planet, now a place of pilgrimage, a statue was erected. It depicted a small, green figure, leaning on a walking stick, his eyes kind, his expression serene. Beneath it, an inscription in low Gothic read. A stranger came among us, and we named him Heretic, but he taught us that faith without wisdom is tyranny, and power without compassion is damnation. May we remember his words, even as we forget his name. Pilgrims came from across the sector, not to worship, but to reflect, to ask themselves the same questions Yoda had asked. Am I choosing this path, or am I simply obeying? Is this suffering necessary, or is it tradition? Can I change, or am I too afraid? And in the warp the Force remained, subtle, unseen, a counterbalance to chaos, not opposing it but offering an alternative, a reminder that the universe was not only hunger and hatred, but also serenity and connection. The Chaos Gods could not destroy it, for it was not theirs to touch. It simply was, as it had always been, a luminous thread binding all living things. Far beyond the galaxy, in the place where the Force converged, Yoda's spirit rested. He was one with the cosmic whole, his consciousness diffused yet aware, watching the ripples of his presence spread through a galaxy he had never meant to visit, and he was at peace. He had not saved the Imperium. That was never his goal. Salvation, he knew, was not something granted. It was something earned, through choice, through struggle, through the willingness to change. He had merely shown them that change was possible. Whether they chose to follow that path or fell back into old patterns was up to them, as it always had been, as it always would be. And so the 41st millennium continued, grim, dark, and filled with war. But now, amid the endless night, there were glimmers, small lights, fragile but persistent, carried by those who dared to ask, what if there is another way? In the end, that was Yoda's greatest gift, not salvation, but a question. And questions, in a galaxy built on absolute certainty, were the most powerful weapons of all. The Force would endure, the Imperium would endure, and in the space between light and darkness, balance would be sought, not by gods or emperors, but by ordinary beings making extraordinary choices. Luminous beings they were, not crude matter, and finally, after eons of forgetting, the galaxy was beginning to remember.